Ever look up at the night sky and wonder what exactly you're seeing up there?
Yeah, definitely.
Like, especially if you're a pilot. You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure, with all those little twinkling lights.
Exactly. And you're up there thousands of feet in the air, so, it's
Oh.
not just some random street light.
Right.
So what happens when even an experienced pilot,
Yeah.
a guy who spent thousands of hours in a cockpit, can't explain what he's seeing?
Yeah, and then things get really interesting.
Well, that's exactly what we're talking about today on Forbidden Unveiled.
That's right.
The story of Japan Airlines cargo flight, 1628, back in November 1986.
This one's a classic.
Definitely a classic and one that's been debated for decades.
Yep, decades.
So picture this. You've got this cargo plane hauling stuff over Alaska, just another routine flight.
Right.
And then boom, the crew reports seeing not one, not two, but 3 UFOs.
3 of them.
Yep, a whole trio. And this wasn't just a quick blip on the radar either.
Oh, no, this was a prolonged encounter.
Yeah, for like a good half hour or so.
And it wasn't just the crew who saw something either. Radar picked up something too, at least initially.
Exactly, at least initially. So yeah, there was definitely something unusual going on up there. And that's what led to a formal investigation.
Definitely.
So let's set the scene a little bit. The date was November 17th, 1986. It was about 5:11 p.m. Alaska time.
Okay.
The flight in question, JAL Cargo Flight 1628, was a Boeing 747-200F, a workhorse of a plane, as you know.
Yeah, those things can really haul.
They sure can. And this one was on its way from Iceland to Anchorage, cruising along at 35,000 feet.
Gotcha.
Now, in the captain's seat was a guy named Kenji Terauchi.
Kenji Terauchi.
Yep, and this guy was no rookie pilot. We're talking about a former fighter pilot with over 10,000 hours of flight time.
Wow, 10,000 hours.
That's right. He knew his way around the sky for sure.
Yeah, this wasn't someone who would mistake a bird for a spaceship.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
So when this guy reports seeing something strange, you got to take it seriously.
Absolutely.
So what exactly did he see? Well, it started with these 2 glowing objects that showed up to the left of his plane.
Glowing objects.
Yeah, they were basically pacing him, almost like they were escorting him or something.
Wow.
At first, Terauchi thought maybe they were military jets, which wouldn't have been too crazy considering they were flying over Alaska during the Cold War.
Right.
But then he realized pretty quickly that these things were something else entirely.
Something else entirely.
Something that he said was not of this earth, as he put it.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty dramatic stuff. And he went on to describe them as being about the size of commercial airliners, but they were emitting these intense bursts of light, and they were making these crazy maneuvers like nothing he'd ever seen before.
Like defying the laws of physics.
Yeah, basically. And then things got even weirder because a third object showed up.
A third one?
Yeah, this massive object that appeared behind the 747.
Oh, wow.
And this thing was huge. Terauchi described it as being shaped like a walnut and about the size of an aircraft carrier.
An aircraft carrier.
That's what he said, which is just mind-boggling when you think about it.
Yeah, try picturing that in the sky.
I know, right? So for about 30 minutes, these things just kind of danced around the plane.
Like some kind of cosmic ballet.
Yeah, kind of. And then they just vanished.
So we've got a credible witness, an experienced pilot who claims to have seen multiple UFOs performing incredible maneuvers and even a massive mothership.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting, because at first it seemed like radar confirmed at least part of his story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, both military and FAA radar systems apparently picked up an object that was following Flight 1628.
Wow.
Yeah, the Anchorage Center specifically reported a radar hit about 5 miles behind the 747.
That sounds pretty convincing.
I know, right? But then wouldn't you know it, things started to get a little murky with the radar data.
What do you mean?
Well, those military radar images that they initially thought showed a UFO,
Right.
well, those were later dismissed as just clutter.
Clutter.
Yeah, like false signals or interference.
Oh, okay.
And then that FAA radar hit that they thought was trailing the plane, well, that was later reclassified as a split image of the 747 itself.
A split image.
Yeah, basically a technical glitch that made it look like there was another object there when there really wasn't.
So the radar evidence is kind of shaky?
Yeah, it's definitely not as clear-cut as it seemed at first.
That's often how it goes with these cases.
And here's another thing to consider. While all this was happening, there were other planes in the area.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a United Airlines cargo plane and an Air Force C-130 were both flying nearby.
Huh.
And guess what? Neither of them reported seeing anything unusual.
Nothing at all.
Nope, not a single thing, not visually and not on their radar either.
That's strange.
It is strange, right? If these UFOs were really as large and as bright as Tarochi described, you'd think someone else would have noticed them.
You'd think so.
So that's another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit.
It's almost like they were invisible to everyone except for the JAL crew.
Yeah, almost like they were in some kind of alternate reality or something.
Oh, no.
Yeah, despite all the conflicting evidence, the FAA did make one thing clear in their investigation.
What's...
They determined that the crew of Flight 1628 were normal, professional, rational, and not under the influence of any drugs or alcohol.
So they weren't just making things up.
Exactly. They were serious about what they saw, even if what they saw can't be easily explained.
So if they weren't lying and they weren't hallucinating, then what were they seeing?
That's a million-dollar question, isn't it?
It sure is.
No, and not everyone believes Tarochi's story, of course.
Oh, right, the skeptics.
Exactly. There are plenty of people who think there's a more down-to-earth explanation for what happened.
Like what?
Well, one of the most famous skeptics, a guy named Philip J. Klass, he had an interesting theory.
Okay.
He thought that those two glowing objects that Tarochi saw at the beginning, those are just the planets, Jupiter and Mars.
Some planets.
Yep. Apparently those planets were visible in the Alaskan sky at that time. And Klass argued that it's actually pretty common for pilots to mistake bright planets or stars for UFOs, especially if they're low on the horizon.
Oh, I see.
He also pointed out that Tarochi never mentioned seeing those planets in his report, which Klass thought was kind of suspicious. Like if you're a pilot and you're looking at the sky, wouldn't you notice two of the brightest objects up there?
Maybe.
But Klass didn't stop there. He also pointed out some inconsistencies in Tarochi's story.
What kind of inconsistencies?
Well, he noted that there were some differences between what Tarochi told air traffic control during the event and what he said in later interviews.
Like he changed his story.
Not exactly, but there were some details that didn't quite match up.
Oh.
Specifically, Klass pointed out that Tarochi gave conflicting accounts of whether he lost sight of the objects after making a turn.
So maybe his memory was a little fuzzy.
Maybe. Or maybe he was embellishing his story. Who knows?
That's true.
And the FAA themselves, they weren't exactly buying Tarochi's story either.
Really?
Yeah, they kind of labeled him as a UFO repeater.
A UFO repeater?
Yeah, because apparently he'd reported seeing UFOs on a couple of other occasions both before and after this incident.
Oh.
Yeah, and the FAA even went as far as to say that one of his later sightings in January 1987, that was probably just diffused light from a village.
So they thought he was just seeing things?
Pretty much. And other skeptics have weighed in on this case too.
Like who?
Well, there's Robert Schieffer, who called this one of the most celebrated UFO cases.
Yeah.
But he also said that Tarochi wasn't exactly an unbiased observer.
Meaning he was predisposed to seeing UFOs?
Yeah, basically. And then there's Brian Dunning, who went even further and said that there was nothing extraordinary or unusual about that night, and that Tarochi was hardly unbiased when it came to alien spaceships.
So they basically thought he was seeing what he wanted to see.
Yeah, pretty much.
So the skeptics have some pretty strong arguments.
They do, but here's the thing. Despite all the skepticism, the FAA did launch a formal investigation into this incident.
They did.
They did. And the guy who was the FAA division chief at the time, a guy named John Callahan, he later confirmed publicly that the radar data and the cockpit communications from that night, they were genuine.
Oh.
Yeah. So even the FAA was acknowledging that something unusual was picked up by radar.
That's pretty big.
It is. And it gets even crazier because Callahan also claimed that the CIA and the FBI got involved and requested the tapes from that night.
The CIA and the FBI?
Yep. And according to Callahan, after that meeting, the whole story was basically buried. Yeah, like they didn't want anyone to know about it.
That sounds like a conspiracy theory.
It does, doesn't it? But it's
Yeah.
coming from a high-ranking FAA official.
No, it's hard to believe.
But thankfully, someone was determined to get to the bottom of this.
Who was that?
A guy named John Greenwald. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get the full FAA records from that night.
Good for him.
I know, right? And it took him 17 years, but he finally got them.
17 years.
That's right. So even though the story was buried for a while, we do have access to the official documents now.
That's amazing.
It is. And those documents include the transcripts of the interviews with the crew of Flight 1628.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and those interviews are pretty revealing. Well, for starters, Karachi's interview was conducted in English, even though an interpreter was present.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and apparently that made parts of the interview a little garbled, which could have led to some misunderstandings about what he actually saw.
Yeah, language barriers can definitely be a problem.
And the interviewer also spent a lot of time asking Tarochi about his previous UFO sightings.
Oh, right, the UFO repeater thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So you have to wonder if that was influencing his perception of what he saw that night.
it's possible.
And then later on, Tarochi provided these really detailed notes to the FAA, and they included some pretty poetic descriptions of UFOs.
Poetic descriptions.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. Like he was almost romanticizing the whole thing.
That's interesting.
Now, the interview with the first officer, Takanori Tamafuji, that was also mainly in English, and it was described as being barely understandable in places.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he said that from his position in the cockpit, he couldn't see much to the left where those first two objects were spotted. And when the objects were supposedly right in front of them, he described them as just lights. He couldn't really make out any shapes or anything.
So his account was pretty different from Tarochi's.
Yeah, very different. And then the flight engineer, Yoshi Tsukuba, he was interviewed in Japanese through an interpreter.
Okay.
And his account was said to be clear and coherent.
Good.
But like the first officer, he couldn't make out any real structure to the objects either.
So neither of them saw what Tarochi saw.
It seems that way, which is pretty strange, right?
It is.
Like you'd think if they were all looking at the same thing, they'd describe it in similar ways.
Yeah, you would think.
Now, the radio transcripts from that night, they paint a pretty chaotic picture of what was going on.
Chaotic?
Yeah, there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty. You could hear it in the voices of the pilots and the air traffic controllers.
Like they didn't know what to make of it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, at one point, Tarochi reported traffic ahead of him, and the Anchorage Center said they were picking up a radar contact 5 miles behind him.
That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't, right. And then the ROCC reported seeing a surge around the airliner on their radar, but they weren't sure if it was real or just a glitch. And then the air traffic control chimed in and said that they were seeing 2 targets, but then they lost track of them.
So everyone's seeing different things.
Pretty much. And the Fairbanks air traffic control, they didn't see anything on their radar except for JAL 638.
So it's all over the
Yeah,
place.
it's a real mess. And the FAA later tried to explain that initial radar blip as an uncorrelated primary and beacon target.
What's that?
Basically, it's a kind of false echo that can happen with radar sometimes.
Oh, okay.
And get this, when the ROCC offered to scramble a jet to go check out what was going on, Tarochi actually declined.
He declined.
He did. He said he'd heard stories about military planes getting into trouble when investigating UFOs, and he didn't want to put them at risk.
That's interesting.
It is, right? Like maybe he was genuinely concerned for their safety, or maybe he was worried that they'd interfere with whatever he was seeing. And then, remember those other 2 planes that were flying nearby?
Yeah.
Well, they were both rerouted to take a closer look at what was going on, and they both reported seeing nothing.
Still nothing.
Nothing at all, just JA 1610 flying along as if nothing was happening.
So we're back to square one.
Pretty much.
So what happened to Tarochi after all this?
Well, he was grounded shortly after the incident.
Grounded.
Yeah, and the whole thing remains a mystery to this day.
A real head scratcher.
It really is. Ufologists, they point to this case as one of the most credible UFO sightings ever because, you know, you've got an experienced pilot and those initial radar reports.
Right.
But then the skeptics, they've got their counter-arguments too, like misidentified planets and inconsistencies in the data and the lack of other witnesses.
And those discrepancies in the crew's accounts?
Yeah, that too. So it's really up to you to decide what you believe.
That's a tough one.
It is, but that's what makes these cases so fascinating. So just to quickly recap what we've learned today, we had a highly experienced pilot who reported seeing multiple UFOs performing incredible maneuvers.
And a massive mothership.
That's right. And initially, radar seemed to confirm at least part of his story.
But then the radar evidence became less clear-cut.
Exactly. And other pilots who were flying nearby, they didn't see anything unusual.
And the crew's own accounts of what happened, they didn't quite match up either.
Nope.
So there are a lot of unanswered questions.
There are, and that's why this case continues to intrigue people even after all these years.
It makes you wonder what really happened up there in the Alaskan sky.
It does, and it makes you think about the limitations of our perception and the way we try to make sense of the unknown.
For sure.
So could it be that in cases like this, there's no single explanation? Could it be a combination of misidentification and unusual atmospheric conditions, and maybe even something truly unexplained?
Maybe.
That's something for you to ponder.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but thanks for joining us on Forbidden Unveiled.
It's been a pleasure.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of UFOs, be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss our next episode.
We'll be back with more forbidden mysteries.
Until then, keep looking up.
And stay curious.
See ya.